Welcome back, everyone. Today we are taking a look at Mythic Mischief. We've pronounced that wrong several times now.
It is Mythic Mischief.
Mythic
it's a little bit
Mischief.
of a tongue tire.
It is. This is a 1 to 4 player game from IV Games that has what looks to be a familiar setting, but it is actually quite different than that certain school of magic.
Right. I mean, the game takes place in a magical library where things move around.
Yes.
And if that sounds like anything, you're making your own comparisons.
Yeah, but
However,
it really ends
it's
there.
very different. I mean, we've got all these different kinds of fantasy kind of people that you're playing as here. Yes, I mean, wizards are one of them. But there are a variety of different factions. In fact, there are 6 different factions that we have here in front of us.
Yeah, there is a 7th faction. We don't have the ghosts here at the table. Or perhaps we do.
Oh, ooh.
But we don't know. No, we don't. We don't have the ghosts here at the table, but there are 7 factions. In fact, we'll just tell you those right now. I've got the wizards here.
Yeah, I got Frankenstein's monsters over here.
The trolls, the zombies.
The vampires, and the witches.
And the cool thing about this game is there's some asymmetry to this.
Oh,
now,
yeah, there definitely is.
The goal that you're trying to achieve in the game is the same, but some of the powers that each faction have are going to behave quite differently than the others and do things in a very different way than any other faction.
Well, let's talk about the goal really quick so you kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. Now, first of all, before you look at the board, I want to say this is a prototype copy. It does look pretty close to final. I mean, this looks great.
It is one of the better prototypes we've received.
One of the, yes, and they put a lot of time and effort, I think, into these minis and in the board, but everything is subject to change.
Yeah.
The entire game revolves around this library, and you have this guy here,
the Tomekeeper.
His whole goal is to move around this board, returning books to their designated spot in the library, which seems like fine. He's just doing his job. But we, as players, want to come into the library and cause mischief. That's our whole goal. So we're going to be running around the library behind the Tomekeeper's back, trying to make sure that our opponents get caught while we remain undetected. So there's a huge puzzle element that's happening here. As this guy moves, you're trying to just always avoid where he's going next.
Yeah, basically, to lay that groundwork a little bit more, there's 3 locations on the board that he's going to move to. And the game is going to be built around a before lunch and after lunch, of course, it's a school, phases. And before lunch, you're going to set up the board in a certain way. Part of that are these 3 locations. He's going to move to 1, then 2, then 3. So at the end of any player's turn, that's going to happen to some degree, and he's going to move varying distances depending on the card here. When he does that, you want the opponents to get caught on your turn. You never want to get caught yourself, though.
Sure, you always want to try to avoid that. And there's a lot of ways that you're going to be able to help your opponents get caught.
Yeah.
But the one thing I really like about this setup, of course, is the variability here. You have a whole stack of these before lunch and after lunch cards that are going to change up the gameplay, maybe change up how far he can move, change where all the library walls are set up, and of course these clusters that are in the middle that just impede movement a little bit. So every time you play, you have a little bit different of a layout, which is going to cause you to think about the game a little differently. Plus, every faction, like David said, has variable powers. Some of your powers are the same, but some of them are different. And all of these powers involve manipulating this board in some way or the other. Either moving your people around the board, moving other people around the board, or moving these walls to kind of create paths to either block the Tomekeeper or to point him into a specific direction.
Yeah, in fact, to take a look at it in a very abstract way, what you're going to be trying to do out here is basically one of 3 different things from time to time. 1, you're going to be wanting to stay out of the way of the Tomekeeper.
Right.
2, you want to get your opponents in the way of the Tomekeeper.
Right.
And 3, you're wanting to collect these tomes that are out here. At the beginning of the game, any player that's playing the game is going to have tomes of their color in very specific places on the board according to this card. When you move into that space, you're going to collect that tome, and it's going to be part of what you use to sort of power up your abilities. But those are effectively the 3 things that you're trying to do, and we have a number of different ways, like Ryan just said, these powers that we have in order to manipulate this ever-changing puzzle. And believe me, it does feel like a puzzle on your turn. When we played our first game, we were like, okay, this sounds pretty straightforward. We sat there, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute, okay. Because you're trying to orchestrate, and I mean orchestrate, the use of all these different powers to try to work it out so that you're going to get as many of your opponent's pieces captured by the Tomekeeper and set yourself up to grab as many tomes as possible.
Yeah, because the Tomekeeper, like I said, is always going to start on the board, and then each player is always going to start with a faction, and you're going to take that faction board. Now, the interesting thing here is that there are always just 2 teams, you and your opponents. So if you're playing 1v1, you each just take one faction board, and you get all 3 of your miniatures, and they're going to spawn on the board in specific spots based on that starting card. However, if you're playing team mode, you're actually going to team up with another player, and you're each going to put 2 of your miniatures on the board to designate your team. So now, between the 2 of us, we actually have 4 miniatures on the board to manipulate instead of the 3. So whether you're playing with 1 through 4 players, you're going to have a similar experience of that tug of war over moving things on the board, but the actual strategy is very different.
Yeah, the strategies are very, very different, and you're going to want to explore those game to game by going and trying another faction. This is definitely one of those games where you're like, okay, I just played the Wizards. Now, me personally, I generally want to play the Wizards again because I want to continue to try to figure them out and get better with them.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are going to go, wait, what do the trolls do? And you're going to look at some of their different powers. And we're going to talk about how some of those work differently than one another in a second. But it really is going to give you reason to say, okay, let's reset this and try it again, and let's try with these new factions.
Yeah, and all those factions have some of the same moves, but the player boards all kind of look the same. You're going to see these dual-layered boards with slots for dice. These dice indicate how powerful each action is. And you'll notice you have 2 move dice and 1 die for every other category, every other action. As the game progresses, you can actually level these up, pushing the dice higher in that particular action. And if you see the little numbers, that's how many times you can do that action on your turn. So theoretically, you could get your move die leveled all the way up to 5, giving you 5 movement with just that 1 die.
Yeah, it's really cool. And when we say dice, we want to be very clear. These are never rolled, and there's no randomness in these things. You're actually just effectively, these dice or cubes are going to be set depending on where they are placed. And at the beginning of the game, they're placed in very specific spots that are indicated on the board. But like Ryan said, throughout the game, you're going to use tomes that you collect to push them further so that you get more of those actions, and potentially at the end of the round, boost a couple of those stats so you can temporarily get more actions of a certain type.
Right, and what you're doing is you're kind of planning out what you want your turn to look like, because you're wanting maybe to boost your movement so you can have a little bit extra movement. Maybe you're wanting to boost your library shelf manipulation because everybody has an ability to move the library shelves. Maybe you think you're going to do a lot of that. And what's interesting is you might plan for a specific set of actions, but by the time the round gets back to you, the board looks so different, you need to think on your feet and start adapting maybe what your strategy was, because things are going to look different. Because based on the things you can do on your turn, you're literally manipulating every aspect of this board.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And let's dive into some of these actions. First, we're going to talk about move just a little bit, but you'll kind of get the sense of what you're doing here. Movement is the same for everyone. You're basically going to tick down one of your cubes when you move in order to move 1 space. Now, some of these, spaces that have clutter, which are basically, I guess, piles of books.
Right.
When you move into those, it's going to take 2 of those pips. So you move it down twice, and you move into clutter. But you're basically going to be moving around the board that way. The other thing is to distract, which is at the bottom. Everyone's distract action is the same as well. When you distract, this is how you're actually going to move the Tomekeeper. And this is interesting because you're going to be moving the Tomekeeper toward one of your figures. So the idea here is to get your figure in a location and your opponent's figure in between you and the Tomekeeper, so that when you use the distract action, you can move him onto their piece and effectively capture it. It's taken off the board, and that is how you're going to score a mischief point.
Yeah, and the other 2 actions are specific to the players, but they do each the same kind of thing. One of them is always going to move your opponent in some way. For example, the monsters can throw. I can literally position myself in a way that I can throw an opponent, hopefully, into the path of the Tomekeeper.
Yes.
Hopefully. Or I can maybe throw them in such a way that they can't really activate their turn the way they want to do it. You're just kind of throwing a wrench into their gears there. That's just mine. I think yours was a warp that let you switch places, right?
Yeah, mine was a warp. So where his is tossing to the other side or the opposite side of his figure, and his figure stays in the same place. My wizards, of course, they're a little bit more magical. They're basically swapping places. So if I used this here, I would effectively change locations with his figure like that if I use the warp. And again, the warp is going to be something that you start with fewer actions on. So if you really want to be able to use your warp a lot more, as you collect those tomes off the board, at the end of your turn during cleanup, you're going to be able to use those tomes. You're going to want to use those on abilities potentially like Warp, or maybe you just want the ability to move around a lot and you'll use your tomes there to move your move cubes up.
The other action is going to allow you to manipulate these shelves. And again, manipulating those shelves is done differently for every faction. For example, Frankenstein's monsters can literally barge through a shelf, pushing it to the side, which will allow them to move through that space. Whereas the wizards shift shelves, which is interesting.
My guys slide the shelves almost like a sliding door. And as similar as that sounds, we can tell you when you play this game, those behave very differently, particularly when you're trying to manipulate things here. The number of times that Ryan, in our first game anyway, tried to barge through a door, what you have to remember is
it's hinges.
It's hinging. So you move it like this and it closes off the space, but it's easy to forget that you're also opening up this other space because you might be thinking you're blocking the Tomekeeper's path, but eventually actually making it so he's reaching you a lot easier.
Because at the end of your turn, you have to move the Tomekeeper, and you have to move him a number of spaces equal to the card. So for example, you have to move him 4 spaces. Now, you know where he's going to go. He's always going to move to the closest or to the next number in progression. And he's always going to move a certain number of spaces. And you, as the player, kind of get to control which path he takes, but he's always going to take the shortest path.
Yeah, he'll take the shortest path unless it's tied, and then the active player gets to pick, which is nice, obviously, because you're going to want to take the path where maybe one of your opponents is.
Right, because if you can manipulate the board in such a way that you've gotten an opponent in the path, or even maybe multiple opponents in the path, when you get to move the Tomekeeper on your turn, he's going to capture or catch everyone that he passes by. So if you've managed to catch your opponent's pieces, you're actually going to score points for that as well. However, if you accidentally put yourself in the path, you'll lose points for that. So it's just a lot of manipulation to create those paths, because you might think, oh, I've got your guys, and then you realize, oh, there's a shorter path that he has to follow, which might completely avoid them.
Yeah, the puzzle at play on your turn is far more significant than we first thought, because when you're taking your turn, you are really trying to make the most of it so that you can capture as many guys as you can. Now, in our experience, capturing one person can be fairly common. You can, because the amount of space that's out here, you're usually going to be able to figure out some way to manipulate to get one person off the board, maybe 2. But just like 2, you can sometimes maybe get nobody off the board. And this game is all about grabbing those mischief points as much as you possibly can, because when the Tomekeeper gets to the 3rd location, you're going to switch to the after lunch. It's going to reset the board to some degree, and then he's going to go through different locations. You flip these tiles over, and there's another 1, 2, and 3 that he's going to. You reset the tomes, and it's effectively just another round like the first half of the game. Once he gets to the 3rd location after lunch, that's going to end the game, and whoever has the most points is going to win, unless someone happens to get to 10 points before that.
Yeah, which seems hard, because the whole goal of your turn is to get your guys in places where your opponent cannot move the Tomekeeper to them no matter what. However, that's hard, because you have so many abilities to manipulate the pathways, to move around other players' figures. You can almost guarantee that you're going to get at least one guy in the path.
Yeah, the other thing that we haven't even talked about in terms of abilities is at the bottom of the board. And they don't recommend you play these with the first game, but we tackled it in our first game.
If you're a gamer, you know that you always use those powers.
Yeah, I would say if you're an enthusiast gamer, you use them. One of those special abilities you start with, and it actually has a space for a tome. And at the beginning of the game, it's going to start with a tome, so you have one use of it. However, when you use that ability, you take the tome off your board, and you can't refill that until you've actually gotten another tome off the board. Right. We haven't talked about the cleanup phase, but when you get all those tomes off the board during your round, they're just going to collect next to your board. And then during cleanup, you're going to do a number of things, including sort of resetting your dice in preparation for the next turn, and then placing those tomes, pushing the dice, and then boosting some of those dice to get a little extra effort out of them.
And yeah, so when you're deciding to repower your special ability, you're effectively deciding not to level up one of your actions.
Right.
Because there's only a certain number of tomes that you can get. There's 4 tomes that come out before lunch, and if you haven't gotten them all, they actually wipe when you come back for after lunch. So you can miss out on some tomes, and the most you're ever going to get is 8. So when you're planning out how you want to build out your board, you need to keep that in mind, that you're probably not even going to get all 8.
Yeah, plus that special power, it's very attractive because
they're super good,
very powerful. Mine was move a wizard to any open space. This is literally taking a wizard and moving it to any open space on the board, which is incredibly powerful. And it's really satisfying when your opponent is not paying attention to the powers that you're planning on using. And it's also very important as a player to take note specifically of what your opponent's powers are, because when in our first game, I thought I'd won. I'd set things up. I'd moved all my people into one corner. The game was about to end on Ryan's next turn. And then he was able to manipulate his player, use his dice that he'd power up, throw my guys into the path, and he actually won by one point in the end.
So you have, you have to be cognizant of that, especially the special abilities. And David's talking about your special ability that you just get all the time.
Yeah.
But then everybody also has an after lunch special that's only going to be usable in the second phase of the game. So after lunch, when you come back, you'll have this special power. These special powers are cool because each one of them involves some kind of special token or set of tokens that's going to go on the board and change things. I've got this trap that can immobilize you. We've got the vampires who collect blood, which is really cool.
Yeah, the wizards have these portals where on your turn you can place one down, and then when you get the other one out, you can treat the two spaces where these reside as adjacent for the wizards only, which again, when you're moving around this board, can be significant.
Yeah, so these things all kind of change up the puzzle of the game. So it's not so much just the layout that's going to change, but which faction you're playing and which faction your opponent's playing is going to completely change the way you play the game. You can't play Frankenstein's monsters against the wizards the same way you play them against the trolls, because some of the strategies you use to block off the wizards, well, the trolls can actually like push those library shelves and get out of those paths. So it's just a completely different experience.
Yeah, and even though we said you're going to want to reset and try it again with different factions, I can already tell, at least for me, this is one of those games where if I played 3 games of this in a row with 3 different factions, I'd have my head in the mindset that I could shift bookshelves. But if you change to someone else and you're like, it can be a rude awakening where you're like, oh, wait, I can't shift shelves anymore.
I want that power back. I want all the powers. Just give me all of them.
But it'll be very interesting to explore the nuances and the differences between those 2 powers in particularly and the 2 powers at the bottom of the board.
Yeah, I'm interested in playing team play as well, because you can actually get 2 factions working together. You can find ways to synergize your powers because you take turns at the same time. And you just use all of your action dice in whatever order you want between the 2 players. So you can set up some pretty crazy combos when you have 2-player boards.
Yeah, that is one thing that we did kind of gloss over, and I think it's important to point out before we wrap up here, and that is when you're taking your turn, you use all the points you can or want to, and then the Tomekeeper moves, and then you clean up, and then it's the other player's turn. So there's no back and forth, so you can actually accomplish quite a bit. But what you need to know, and we learned this the hard way too, you really can't do things to set up the board so that you're 100% safe. You just don't know, or you don't appreciate at first how much the other player can accomplish on their turn. And there's very little board space here. This is not like a massive board where I'm way over here hiding. Someone can get to you, generally speaking, and more often than not, you're overlooking the fact that they have a power that they can use that you were not thinking about coming.
You think you're safe. Next thing you know, you're teleporting over, you're warping to switch positions with me, shifting a bookshelf, and now the Tomekeeper can just move right through to me.
For sure.
So there's really no such thing as being safe, but that keeps the game moving at a pretty fair pace. You're at least probably getting 1 or 2 points every single turn if you're playing smartly. I mean, it's a game where you can.
It's going to stay close.
Really think about it.
You're gonna get a point or 2, maybe sometimes 0 points on your turn, but it's gonna stay close most of the time. And there are some modes too that we haven't even covered. There is a solo mode covering at the time that we're recording this. The solo mode was still being developed, and we haven't tried the team mode. And they even have what they call a blitz mode, which could be interesting. Think of it as speed chess.
Yeah.
Because you effectively have to use a timer and time yourself. Now, this could come into play, I think, for some people, because when we first started playing, we really thought this was going to move very fast, and it does in many respects. But a player can sit there and think, okay, how can I perfectly plan this entire turn out? And there's a lot of things you're trying to orchestrate to make that happen.
I mean, you can't do it, but you'll try.
No, you'll try. And there's going to be times where you're like, okay, I'm going to move this bookshelf. Oh, wait a minute. Nope, I can't do that.
Like you get ready, like, oh, if I move here, what happens? You're like, oh no. Like you realize you're trapped. You've trapped yourself. There's no way you can get out. Like. But there's just some things that you have to really consider every time you make a move.
And those things are less frustrating than they are just fun puzzles to solve on your turn, I think.
Yeah, because nothing really bad ever happens to you. I mean, you might lose a guy off the board and your opponent will get a point, but you just bring those guys back into the board again. And, you know, sometimes losing a guy off the board is good because you can bring them back completely in a different space and use them to collect those tomes or to interact with your opponent. So there's a lot of ways to take advantage of these strategies. I don't think this is a game that feels frustrating.
No, not at all.
It's just, you know, on your turn, you're always going to be able to do a lot. You always know you'll be able to do a lot.
I do think this is really well balanced. In our few plays of this, I was really taken with how well even sort of the asymmetry of these powers feels balanced. Like we said, the two powers are somewhat similar. They achieve similar things in that you're moving shelves or you're moving your opponent, but they do so in such a different way that it definitely brings a lot of flavor.
It does for sure. So that is Mythic Mischief. The game is going to be coming out on GameFound soon, so you'll be able to look at that page and see the other faction, the Ghosts, that we may or may not have at this table right now. The Ghosts look pretty cool, and they offer their own cool little interactions as well. So hopefully by now you have a pretty good idea of how this game plays, what this game offers, and whether or not this game is right for you. Please leave a comment below. Let us know which faction you're most excited about, or just what aspect of this game you think is the coolest.
Yeah, and until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.